Hello there. I'm Sean Murray, and this is The Nose, the pop culture roundtable on the Colin McEnroe Show. Colin is off playing hooky today, as he's been known to do. Today's episode is for the intellectuals among us. None of that fiction nonsense, narrative films, silly little sitcoms. No, we're going to talk about real things that actually happened. But don't let that scare you away. First up, we will be digging into Apple TV's new 5-part docuseries about one of the great filmmakers of the last 2,025 years, Mr. Scorsese. And then later, we'll discuss the frankly not so new, but finally available for American audiences, No Other Land, which won this year's Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature and is a joint production between Palestinian and Israeli filmmakers that gives an intense and up-close look at the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. Look, folks, all due respect to the man, but are there any more devastating words in the English language than from WHYY in Philadelphia, this is Fresh Air, I'm Dave Davies in for Terry Gross? Are you kidding me? No! Get lost, Dave. Well, consider me your own personal Dave Davies, as I, the Diamond Boy Sean Murray, am once again in for Colin McEnroe, who is off filming the new motion picture, The Second to Last Temptation of Christ. Spoiler alert, he was tempted to commit a jewel heist at the Louvre. Interesting stuff. Today, we'll talk about the new Apple TV docuseries, Mr. Scorsese, and the Academy Award-winning documentary feature, No Other Land. And then we'll do some endorsements. My esteemed panel on the nose this week includes James Hanley, co-founder of Cinestudio at Trinity College, Lindsay Lee Wallace, a writer and journalist covering culture, health, technology, bats, and anything else people will answer questions about, and Bill Usman, professor of media studies at Sacred Heart University. Mr. Scorsese is a 5-part, almost 5-hour documentary series streaming on Apple TV, directed by Rebecca Miller, who happens to be Daniel Day-Lewis's wife. Here's Apple's description of it. Mr. Scorsese is a film portrait of a man through the lens of his work, exploring the many facets of a visionary who redefined filmmaking, including his extraordinary career and unique personal history. Let's hear a little bit from that first episode. This is A1.
Can I just say one thing? Thank God for asthma. He was cooped up and couldn't go outside.
In the front, 3rd floor front, and I look out the window and see, the world below. I've been always looking out the window. That's why I like high-angle shots. Seriously, it's like a fresco coming to life.
If you ever went to the apartment, there were old windows with small panes. So he has to watch pane by pane. What does that remind you of? It's film. And then in the summer, they couldn't afford air conditioning. His asthma got to be really bad, so Marty would just cough all night and had difficulty breathing.
When he got those attacks, and you can't help him, you want to break the walls apart.
His father would take him to 42nd Street, and they would go from movie theater to movie theater.
There was no air conditioning at all, anywhere, except a movie theater. Movie theaters said cooled by refrigeration. People would just go in there to be cool. They didn't care what film it was.
And that's how Marty saw movies. Marty's life depended upon going to movies. That's where he could breathe.
So I thought this was terrific, and not just as like a fan of Martin Scorsese, but I just also thought it was like really well structured and like a very in-depth documentary that like there's a lot of stories in here that I had heard before, but hearing them sort of fully explored and then getting multiple perspectives on it, I thought was awesome. Bill, I feel like you're my own personal Bob De Niro, so I want to start with you. And I say De Niro and not Leo because of your age, of course. So what did you feel about Mr. Scorsese?
So I was primed to be into this because Scorsese has for a really long time been one of my really most favorite American film directors. I've been watching his films for literally decades, since you had to bring up my age again. I've seen so many of them at Cinestudio at Trinity College in Hartford. So thank you personally to James Hanley for enhancing my life in that way. And so to just be able to hear him talk about his films, hear all of the other people, Steven Spielberg, Spike Lee, so many others talk about both Scorsese as a person and as a filmmaker. I thoroughly enjoyed it. 5 hours is not too long. In fact, it's just a few minutes shorter than his next film. Both you and I and Mick Nichol said that we could have been sitting with it for a few more episodes. I just think it really does do a really wonderful job of exploring both the man and the films and the period of time that the films were made in, which is so crucial to, the whole thing that he does.
No, absolutely. You're talking about the length thing. Me and McDickle are a big fan of this podcast, Blank Check, and they cover directors' filmographies. I could go through their whole spiel that they say, but I'm not going to do it. But anyway, a lot of times, a lot of the fans of the show often want them to do Scorsese, but that'll just take up such a huge chunk of the year, and they always wonder, like, well, that's going to take... But I always feel like I would love to get a full exploration of his entire career, because even this, it kind of... I don't want to say glosses over, but it doesn't. There's a couple of periods of time in a couple of movies that they don't really go as right. in depth on, and I would love to hear those stories. But maybe those are on the cutting room floor. But James, I feel like you're the Nose's official movie guy. So I want to know, like, what's your relationship with Marty, but also just this doc and just all of it.
Well, I think that my connection really is that his career sort of was starting up just as Cinestudio was starting up, and we were playing a lot of those films. And I think the remarkable thing really is that at the time he was really the only sort of almost European style director, a kind of an auteur that people were interested in seeing his films, and he was crossing the divide between commercial cinema and art house cinema. And we were at a particular time when Cinestudio first opened, there were no video recorders, there were no computers, and there was the only way you could see movies was on screen in a theater. And I remember the exciting feeling of we had full houses, more than we actually had less than 500 seats, but sometimes we had more than 500 people. There were some people standing. And I think that the films, probably the most dramatic response was Mean Streets and Taxi Drivers. Both of those films drew huge crowds. And at the same time, those were films that were not drawing huge crowds outside of, say, New York City or Chicago. The release of those films wasn't as wide as you would expect now. And I think that I found those films really formative and interesting to me. I had been a huge Alfred Hitchcock fan, and I'd been fascinated with the way he made films and how he made storyboards, and he knew exactly what he was going to shoot right from the beginning. He had a sort of like an intuitive sense, and so he didn't waste any film. And Martin Scorsese does it in a different way, but he does have that sense, that cinematic sense. That comment about him looking through the window and the shot the overhead shot looking down on characters is very indicative of that sense of observing and letting you figure out what's going on. And that was something to me that also linked with the Italian neorealist cinema of the 1950s, which we were also showing, and a lot of people hadn't seen in the U.S. Audiences were not aware of a lot of these films that were really absolutely seminal films that were part of Europe's emergence from World War II. And I think that Martin Scorsese was influenced by them as well. And it's interesting, you talk about how that film could have been longer. I have a feeling there could have been quite a discussion of that.
So that's fascinating to me because, like you said, you were there at the start. So, like, for you, it was always clear that Martin Scorsese was one of, like, he was a real talent. Because something they talk about in the documentary a lot is that he's kind of had like a critical like reappraisal. He wasn't always looked at as one of the great filmmakers. He was sort of doing street movies, and so you personally, you always felt that you were witnessing something like great being born?
Yes, absolutely, with no doubt at all. The interesting thing is that I think that a lot of the mainstream critics at the time were they weren't ready for the visceral sense of violence, for example,
Yeah.
the ability to show exactly what was going on and actually not do cartoon violence, but actually throw it right up in people's faces and see consequences of what happened when people behaved like that. But there was also this almost surrealistic quality, particularly with Taxi Driver, with the actual cinematography. And of course, Robert De Niro, who famously in this documentary, he doesn't talk much. He's somebody who conveys so much with his look and with exactly, his whole appearance, his body stance, and all of that. And I think that this was something I can't quite say how exciting it was. It was the kind of thing that when you were walking past, we might be showing it for a week, and every time you walked past the auditorium, you had to stop and watch.
Lindsay, so I feel like you don't have as strong a relationship with Scorsese. So how did this work for you?
That would be true. There's a part of the series where his daughter Francesca says that a lot of her friends or like people in her cohort don't really know who he is, which I found hard to believe. But she says that they don't know who he is, but then she mentions Wolf of Wall Street and they're like, oh, he directed Wolf of Wall Street. And that is kind of that's where I generally am at as well. Not as much a scholar of his work, but that made this a really entertaining watch because it was just simultaneously like a history of really pivotal moments in like Hollywood. And I also, there are a lot of movies or references that I didn't know were Scorsese, and now I know that. So I will reappraise the scene in Lindsay Lohan's Parent Trap remake where she goes, "You talking to me?" and I will better understand the real weight of it.
No, that's actually really interesting too, because like for me, I am a big Scorsese fan, but like speaking of that Parent Trap scene, like there's so many things that I didn't realize were a reference to another better thing until I got into films, because like we're around a similar age, so it's like what movies of his have you seen, and like what did this give you a new sense of appreciation for him, or
definitely I mean I've seen the most recent Scorsese movie that I saw was Shutter Island because I realized I hadn't seen it and it felt like an appropriate Halloween watch. And to hear them talk about that movie and how deeply it affected him, like the experience of making it, it also gave me renewed respect for that movie because watching it, I was like, wow, this is silly. But also there's obviously an enormous amount of effort that goes into it. And it's kind of a good reminder on the whole in like an era of it's so easy to criticize anything. Like the forces that are mobilized to bring any piece of art to you, no matter what you think of it, are so profound that it's worth keeping in mind that I may be watching, Leonardo DiCaprio like look a little bit crazy scrabbling over rocks, but Martin Scorsese was like in a mental health crisis the entire time. So worth remembering about the cost of art. I think that I definitely now want to go watch more things because I feel like you said, Sean, that there are references I didn't realize, and I am going to be able to like understand where those came from, which is meaningful.
I think something about this that's really well done is like the structure of it. Like it's broken up into 5 parts, and like again, we've all said it could have been longer, but I just want to talk about that. Like I think the way they give each sort of period of his career its own episode. Like at the end of the first episode, they set up like this thing with Robert De Niro, but like they don't know it's coming, and then it's like it kind of just they're like, oh, and I started working with this guy, and they're like, who's this guy, Bob? And then they show a picture of Robert De Niro, and then it cuts to the credits, and you're like, I'm definitely watching the next episode. Like I was gonna watch it anyway, but I don't know. How did you feel about the structure of it?
That part hit me just the way it hit you. Lori and I, my wife, we were watching the first episode. And, I was enjoying it. I was into it. And then they introduced that part right at the very end. It's like, okay, here comes De Niro. This is going to supercharge him to this completely other place. Kind of like how I'd like to think I do for you, Sean.
Absolutely.
But,
yes.
We can debate that off air. But it was really like such a great moment that it just pull you in right to the next episode. Here we go. Okay, now we're experiencing this whole nother thing, and the synergy between him and De Niro. You know, a few weeks ago on The Nose, we talked about the synergy between Spike Lee and Denzel Washington.
Yeah.
De Niro and Scorsese have worked together even more than those two did, and it just brought something out in terms of that exploration of darkness. You know, the two of them together. James mentioned the violence of his films, and there's this great moment when Spike Lee says, I don't want to name any names, but he says there are other filmmakers who think violence is fun.
And we all know who he was
He's talking about Tarantino.
Yeah,
everybody
absolutely.
knows he's talking about Tarantino if you know that long-standing beef between the two of them. But what Scorsese does with violence is he just explores the darkness and the depravity behind the American experience. Maybe Gangs of New York does that most explicitly, but I think the other films do that as well. And hooking up with De Niro, he found the perfect actor who could embody that in a way that it just carries so much. I can't imagine any other actor inhabiting those particular roles the way that De Niro did.
Absolutely. It's funny.
That didn't really answer your question about the structure.
Of course not. Of course not. I never expected you to answer my question.
But then in terms of the structure, this goes chronologically, so then we get to DiCaprio, right,
Yeah.
eventually. But it's structured chronologically, but at the same time, not in the clock's ticking, the calendar pages are ticking, but in a thematic way.
I think it's also funny how they set up the Bob De Niro thing, and then, like James said, he has nothing to offer almost. Like he says like 3 words every time they show him on camera.
Oh, in this documentary.
Yeah, it's funny because like for Scorsese's career, it is a big impact, but on the documentary, it actually doesn't make the documentary that much better. It's just a funny thing. James, because of the structure, you kind of get to see the ebb and flow of Marty's career. I love calling him Marty, like I'm his old pal from Mulberry Street. You get to see the ebb and flow of his career, and then like as a younger person, I just see Martin Scorsese as Martin Scorsese. He's always been great. He's always been so like as someone who ran a cinema. Like how did you get to experience his career, sort of the ebbs and flows of it, and like his recovery from those dark periods?
Well, actually, I think that's what the documentary does very well. In a way, Martin Scorsese is another character in the movie. It's like the documentary is a movie itself.
Yeah.
And we were certainly conscious of those rare times when there were interviews with Martin Scorsese. He wasn't particularly articulate. He was a person who seemed to know what he wanted to do, but also a flawed person who was obviously conflicted. And I think that's one of the reasons why he clicked with Robert De Niro, because Robert De Niro is a kind of internalized person. And you could see that he was a person who could become this extraordinarily magnetic personality in film. But it wouldn't be through talking his way in. It would be who he is. And Martin Scorsese's trajectory, his arc, if you like, through the documentary is very interesting because it comes through his angst, his drug use, his sort of, almost faux ambition that he wanted to make big films with the big film industry and make money and then maybe be able to make the films he wanted to make. But at the same time, he's not really willing to actually go along with that. I mean, if you have to look at the times that when Taxi Driver came out, the industry people were aghast at the violence in that. And the mainstream studios were, they were so incredibly hypocritical about this. It was okay to, have cartoon violence and to have people totally disrespected, but without any sort of serious on-screen, any kind of like consequence to it that actually mattered to the story. And so he was really upsetting these people. And they were not just the money people at the studio, but the artistic people and the producers, what they would produce. And then, to me, one of the most extraordinary examples that confirms that sort of exciting arc that I experienced sort of, in a theater showing his films was that when he got the Academy Award finally, he said, he was very humble about it. He said, well, I don't think I was ready before this. Now I understand something different. And the Academy Award meant something very, very different than what it would have meant before. I mean, before he could make jokes about not getting the Academy Award. And not getting the Academy Award, I mean, we all know the politics of Academy Awards and, who gets in on it and where those decisions get made. Until recent years, it was all old white men who decided this, and that there were no deviations from that. And he was going in another direction, clearly. And then when he comes to that realization, when he gets the Academy Award, and it comes from people who really are beginning to understand what it means to be a person like Martin Scorsese, who's not a charismatic, self-confident person, but actually a kind of like he knows he's got something to say, but he's also afraid.
That's interesting too. Like you said, he's not super charismatic, but Lindsay, like something I felt when watching this is that I love his presence on screen. Like James talks about how Marty is sort of a character in himself. And I feel like just getting to sit there and watch him on screen and his mannerisms and how he talks. And
I love the way he laughs.
Yes.
He's got just this great laugh.
So, like, I want to get your opinion on just Martin Scorsese himself, but also I kind of was thinking about, like, you're also, like I said, you're kind of our Scorsese neophyte here. So, like, how aware of some of these trials and tribulations in his career were you prior to this?
Not very at all, which I feel like I'm really embarrassing myself, but there's nothing I can do about it now. I was very surprised to learn the majority of what was shared about, the dark periods of his life. I didn't know that he had such significant struggles with mental health or with substances. And I also didn't know how many times he had been married or how much his second to last wife was obsessed with the small size of his body. She just kept talking about
so
this tiny man.
So many times she's like, Marty's so small.
Yeah. Which I also didn't know what a tiny, tiny man he was. So, grateful for that information as well. But I genuinely, he is such a wry presence. And I think it's really, for somebody who is obviously so obsessed with narrative, to be participating in the narrativization of his own life and his career and the effect that he's had on Hollywood is something that you can see that he's aware of it. And he even at one point says, I want to answer you right away, but I have to think about what I'm going to say, because he knows that he's creating a record that is going to outlive him of the impact that he has had. And that in and of itself would be a really intense amount of weight for anybody, and then for the character that you come to understand him to be, a particularly intense weight.
Wow, that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely.
I think too, talking about the ebbs and flows, I don't think we have a ton of time for this, but just like I said, I'm younger. The Departed won Best Picture 2006, so I was 13. So I've always seen Martin Scorsese as Martin Scorsese, this sort of great director. So it's fascinating, and it's something I kind of was aware of before the documentary, but he talks about it a lot in this one, about how hard it was for him to get certain movies made. He was trying to get Last Temptation of Christ off the ground forever. Gangs of New York, he was trying to get off the ground for over 20 years. Silence is another one. And James, I think you're the perfect person to talk about. Isn't it fascinating the way the film industry is, that somebody of his stature who has made as many great films as anybody could possibly make still has a hard time getting movies made?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the curious thing about the film industry, I could talk for hours about the conflicts and just personally negotiating with members of the industry to actually put something on the screen can be a story in itself. But I think that there were, by the time after Taxi Driver, there were people in the mainstream industry who wanted to be seen with Martin Scorsese. They wanted to be associated with him because they liked the idea of being with, quote unquote, a serious filmmaker, which by that time he had developed that reputation. And I think that the most sort of complicated example of how this can work is how Gangs of New York, which was out there for so many years, and he really wanted to make that real story, and he had a script, and there was all sorts of support for it, but no money. I mean, it was an incredibly expensive project. And then along comes somebody with a lot of money, Harvey Weinstein, who was really notorious for interfering with productions with his own comments, kind of like that there were people, the head of MGM, Louis B. Mayer, was known for this sort of and David O. Selznick with Alfred Hitchcock, trying to control it based on their own impression of what was going on. And Harvey Weinstein was only interested in Gangs of New York as being a big hit about these gangs fighting. And it was like, to him, I think, a thriller based on that. But the story behind it was much more complex. And I think it's clear from the documentary that Martin Scorsese was very frustrated with how he attempted to manipulate that, and in fact cut a lot of the film. There were many scenes that were cut from the film that don't really make sense anymore. And I think that in those, what happens there is that incredible clash that happens all the time between art and commerce, and the Hollywood studios are about the money, ultimately. And Harvey Weinstein in particular was somebody who wanted to dominate everybody because he wasn't seen as a major. The Miramax company was not seen as the equivalent of a Warner Brothers or the 20th century. That they really you really got an incredible hunger to make these successful commercial films that didn't really necessarily mesh with what Scorsese was trying to do. And I think it's extraordinary that Gangs of New York came out at all, and that it came out in the form it did. It's still a great film, but it's missing some important parts.
I could literally talk about this documentary, just the Gangs of New York stuff forever, how much Harvey Weinstein sucks. We can talk about that forever. But we need to take a short break. We'll come back and talk about the Academy Award winning documentary, No Other Land, so stay with us. You're listening to the Colin McEnroe Show. I'm Sean Murray, and for Colin McEnroe, this is The Nose, our pop culture roundtable. I'm here with James Hanley, co-founder of Cinestudio at Trinity College; Lindsay Lee Wallace, a writer and journalist covering culture, health, technology, bats, and anything else people will answer questions about; and Bill Usman, professor of media studies at Sacred Heart University. No Other Land is what we're talking about this segment. It won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature this year. World premiered at the 2024 Berlin Film Festival more than 20 months ago, and it just became widely available basically for the first time ever in this country this week. Here's a synopsis. For half a decade, Basel Adra, a Palestinian activist, films his community of Masafer Yatta being destroyed by Israel's occupation as he builds an unlikely alliance with an Israeli journalist who wants to join his fight. No Other Land is an unflinching account of a community's mass expulsion and acts as a creative resistance to apartheid and a search for a path towards equality and justice. No Other Land is in Arabic, English, and Hebrew. I think I should just say before we get going that The Nose is a show about pop culture, and while our pop culture is political, I think we used to say that the nose isn't here to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think we're just here to talk about this very important movie that won an Oscar and is now finally available to be watched. As I was watching No Other Land last night, I was thinking about this segment and how it might be a real challenge to talk about this movie, and not the challenge of trying to avoid putting my foot in my mouth, because I'm going to do that anyway probably, but more because you watch it and with every scene you're just kind of just like, yep, F word, like this is awful, and it's, this is made as sort of a combo of found footage, I guess, so to speak, recorded largely by the young man Basel in the film, and I guess what you would call traditional documentary filmmaking with more professional cameras. But using the term found footage sort of makes me think this is ostensibly a documentary, but what we're really watching, to me, is a horror movie. It's like, it's not scary like The Exorcist or whatever, but it's as intense and disturbing as anything I've seen, and I think it's because it's real. It's not a possessed lady climbing up the walls. It's real depravity being perpetrated by actual human beings against actual human beings. So, Lindsay, I wanted to start with you here. What were you feeling while watching this, and how do you think it works as a documentary?
I completely agree with you that, like, it's a horror film. You're watching, if you think about home invasion as a concept that people are so afraid of, you're watching the total destruction of people's homes, and you're watching the uncertainty of whose home is going to get destroyed next. And something about it as a documentary is that I felt like it was very chaotic in terms of the tone shifting constantly, and that was a perfect encapsulation of what it would be like to, be relieved and celebrating that your father's been released from prison one day, and then to see your school demolished the next day. And there is no, neat break between those things or opportunity to process even one of them. Like, even one of the things that happens in this story would, bring me to my knees, and they happen just constantly. And that's a really powerful thing to depict. And it's equally powerful to depict how completely silent the Israeli soldiers and the settlers that are shown in the film are throughout all of it, when they're being asked, like, why are you doing this? How could you do this? And they're just completely quiet. And it's interesting to think about, the resistance to having made this film widely available to be viewed here. And part of the reason for that being that it makes the Israeli military look bad. And all it does is show them doing exactly what they were told to do and what they apparently feel justified in having done, and to stay silent in the face of being questioned, which is clearly in line with their training. So it's interesting to say that you could make somebody look bad and look scary just by rolling tape of them behaving exactly as they feel justified to behave. But it certainly does that. It is absolutely terrifying.
Bill, one of the things that gets discussed in the film by Basel and other members of Masafer Yatta is how important it is for them to record all of this footage to show the world what's happening. But this movie was shot in the years leading up to 2023, and even with October 7th aside, I think things have only gotten worse for Palestinians since then. So like, when you watch this, like, do you feel hopeless? Like, what are you feeling when you watch it?
That's a really essential question to ask about this documentary, because I think that's one of the essential themes of the documentary, one of the essential difficult questions that the documentarians are dealing with. What's the point of even making this in some way? There's this dialectical tension between, we have to document this, we have to record what is happening, but what's going to change? How is this going to make any difference in the world that we're living in? And at a couple points, they challenge Yuval as a journalist. They say, what do these stories that you write do? Does anyone even read them? And in some ways, like, I don't want to discourage people from listening to this segment of the show, but I do kind of feel like I have to say there is nothing we can tell you during this segment of the show that substitutes for seeing this film. You just have to see this film. You shouldn't talk about the film. You shouldn't argue about it. You shouldn't argue about the conditions that it depicts without seeing it. Just see it. And I think that in and of itself answers the question of, is this worthy of documentation? I don't know if it will change anything. I do know that since October 2023, some of what's been happening in Palestine for decades is finally starting to get exposed to the rest of the world, and that opinions are starting to shift because of that exposure. And what this film does is it shows us that it's not just Gaza, but it's the West Bank also, and the terrors that are inflicted on the people who are just trying to live their lives in the West Bank. There is no way to encapsulate it in words. You have to see it. You have to see the bulldozers crashing through the school buildings and the people's homes, and the people having to retreat to living into caves, and realizing that this is happening in our world right now, even as we speak. And so it's a scream, it's a cry for help in a world that up until now has shown that they don't even really want to listen.
Absolutely. Bill, James, I don't actually really have a question, but I just want to get your general thoughts on it as well.
Well, I mean, I too was horrified watching it, and I felt, I don't know, I think that documentation is essential. And I think that there's a sign that there's obvious helplessness watching it and feeling, what can you do? How can you watch this terrible crime against humanity, this war crime that is happening in front of you? What can you do? And I think that this is being faced by a lot of people, that the whole nature of what journalists do. Look how many journalists have tried to tell what's happening in Gaza, that so many have been killed. They've been indiscriminately killed, just like everybody else there. And this is something that, in honor of what they have done, what they've given their lives for, you have to watch this. You have to know. You have to see the documentation. And I think it's not just there. I think documentation generally, the world has changed very drastically with the availability of constant video documentation.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think it's a reminder of what's happening on the streets of Chicago and
yes.
Portland. This is a warning. This is something that really you, at the very least, have to document it, because at some point there's going to be some way of accounting for this behavior, for accounting for what has been done to destroy people's lives, because this is the core of what human existence is about, and it's unavoidable. And I think it's really it's a real commentary on American media that it's not emerged on American screens until so late. Mm-hmm. That the Academy apparently felt that the Academy Award was enough, and it wasn't any pressure, that they didn't put any pressure on people to release it. I mean, what's happened to the A24s and the neon pictures of the market, who regularly pick up independent cinema? Why is it that they didn't pick it up?
Well, that's exactly. I wanted to actually talk about that. Like, we've all talked about how important it is to document these horrors, but then this is a movie that won Best Documentary Feature at the Oscars, the biggest movie award, ceremony on the planet, and yet this is the first time we were able to see it. So, like, it makes it very difficult for like they talk about in the film about how important it is for people to see what's happening if no one is actually able to see what's happening. I don't know, Lindsay, I don't know, just let's talk about that. The fact that we can have something this important take place, and it's not just like, okay, we haven't seen Basil's, camcorder footage. This is a film, and it's unable to be seen by so many people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that they had an initial deal from Mubi for distribution, and they turned it down because Mubi gets funding from Sequoia, which is a venture capital firm that also has ties to a military technology company that's run by former Israeli soldiers. And it's it's this of course, it completely makes sense that they would not want to have a film about the destruction of Palestinian lives at the hands of Israel be distributed by a company that has those ties. And at the same time, the entire goal of making it is to have as many people as possible see what's happening, and for people to be put in a position where they have to say, like, our principles are such that the goal of making this is second to not accepting this tie is, I think it's something that we're all kind of having increasingly to reckon with anyway, because we are, not to say that there hasn't always been enormous corporate influence in our government, but our everyday lives, it's becoming increasingly clear the way that legislation, the way that choices are being made to benefit the interests of corporations above all else. And so many things that I do every day put a small amount or maybe a large amount of money in the pocket of a company that's doing things that I vehemently disagree with. And this is one example of, what's taken away from people is the opportunity to see something that we badly need to see, because the filmmakers were forced to make a choice, because the bodies that are supposedly existing to distribute this film, the bodies that supposedly exist to give us access to things that we need, are tied to forces that are morally untenable.
Absolutely. I just want to clarify for the audience, Mubi is a streaming service. She wasn't just saying movie.
Yeah,
it's MUBI movie. James, you're somebody who, Cinestudio, you would present films to people. So, I just want to get you to talk a little bit about, the relationship between, theaters and distributors and how difficult it is to get certain movies in front of certain eyes.
Well, I can tell you, when you're operating a theater, very often the only course you have is to go through days and days of phone calls and track down the people who own the rights, the people who made the film, or the people who are actually controlling it. Because, it was bad enough in the latter years that I was working at Cinestudio, but now with the industry consolidation, one company, Disney, controls more than half of distribution of media in the United States, and in that atmosphere, it's very hard to actually persuade any of those actors to actually make a film available. So in this case, what happened, I think, to get it shown was contacting the original filmmakers, and the filmmakers basically make a deal directly. And one of the changed aspects of it from when I was working at Cinestudio, in the latter part, I was part of the digital change, but digital cinema has really changed the score on how these films can get out.
To the audience, like Bill said, please check out this film. It's available to rent all over the place. And we'll be back after a quick break, and we'll do some endorsements. Stay where you are. Welcome back. This is The Nose. I am Sean Murray, and for the great Colin McEnroe. Before we get to endorsements, just a couple of thank yous. Jonathan McNichol is the producer of this show and The Nose in general. And once again, I got to thank Colin for having me back to guest host. I don't know why he does it, but I'll take it. So we'll get to endorsements. James, what you got for us?
There's one that I mentioned before, two films that I wanted to mention. One is actually related to some of the discussion we've been having today. It's Guillermo del Toro's new version of Frankenstein, which I really recommend to people to see. It's an extraordinary journey of thinking about the whole nature of what a movie is, really. And del Toro has been trying for years to make this film. And Jacob Elordi plays the so-called monster, who is not at all a monster. It's a fascinating journey into what humanity really is. And if you can see it on a big screen, really do it. The other one is that there's a new 4K restoration of a British thriller from 1945, made at a studio just a few streets away from where I grew up, Ealing Studios. It's called Dead of Night, and it's a film compilation of nightmares being related by different characters, directed by different directors. And it is one of the most shocking and creepy films I've ever seen. And this restoration is magnificent. So
it's so
Dead of
good.
Night.
I just have to jump in. It's so good. I saw it decades ago at Cinestudio.
Oh, great.
And
Okay.
I still remember it. So second that endorsement.
Well, since you decided to jump in, let's get your endorsement.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep talking for the next hour, Sean, so you're going to be upset about that. So I was just going to say, okay, here's my favorite Scorsese films, but I'm not going to do that, although I will say Goodfellas is better than The Godfather. That's right. You can fight me about that. I don't care. But instead, I'm going to lean into the second half of the show, and I want to endorse two books that illuminate what's been going on in Palestine for a really long time. The first is a nonfiction book called The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, by Rashid Khalidi, who is one of the great Palestinian writers and historians. And it really shows what's been going on for a very long time and the reality of life on the ground in Palestine, and that history didn't start on October 7th, 2023. And then the other one is a novel, also by a Palestinian author, Isabella Hamad, called Enter Ghost, which is, people will recognize that as a stage direction from Hamlet. The novel is about a Palestinian theater group trying to put on a 2017 production of Hamlet in the West Bank, and everything that they experience and go through as they're trying to bring this to fruition under, very, very difficult situations, and drawing some really interesting parallels between Hamlet and the struggles of the Palestinian people. So I think that's a novel, but it also illuminates what's really going on in some very deep and beautiful ways.
All right, Lindsay, you got 90 seconds. Bring us on home.
Okay, Bad
Don't
Company, Private Equity, The Death of the American Dream by Megan Greenwell, not rushing anymore, is a great book that discusses some of what we touched on when we were discussing the distribution issues that no other land had in the U.S. because of Mubi's connection to Sequoia Capital. My other endorsement is that everyone should listen to Melissa Etheridge, because this Saturday will be 6 years since my mom, Debbie Ann Richter Wallace, passed away, and she loved Melissa Etheridge, so everyone should enjoy some on her behalf.
Great endorsements. Yeah, you went shorter than I thought. Maybe I'll get to endorse something. I would like to second 100 Years War in Palestine for sure. I'm going to do the thing Bill was going to do. Well, not my favorite Scorsese, but I think an underrated one, which is The Color of Money. I feel like
so good.
That is
so good.
One of his. It's actually my friend of mine, my friend Jiro. If you're listening, shout out Jiro. It's his favorite Scorsese, which I think is a little crazy, but I think it's one of those movies where it's like, oh, one for you, one for them. People always look at it as a one for them, like he's doing a studio picture to get money. But it's like a sequel to The Hustler, and it's amazing. And it's Paul Newman, who might be the best movie star we've ever had, and a young Tom Cruise. And it's just a great, a sequel to The Hustler should not work, and yet it's incredible. So that is my endorsement.
Werewolves of London, baby.
Exactly.
Such a great scene.
Yeah, that's so good. But obviously Marty's got a ton of great movies, so check them out, Lindsay. And yeah, that is our show. Thank you guys for joining the panel, and we'll see you soon.
Very, very cool place to hang out. Yeah. It's cozy, like a Cracker Barrel. Yeah, we all be laughing, talking, joking, talking about this and talking about that, and talk about everything as a matter of fact. Oh yeah, talk about Torrington, Vernon, Danbury, Waterbury, Alderberry, Woodbury, hitting on New Britain. Vernon, I already said that one. Avon, Farmington, yeah, 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 yeah.